It's 2 minutes past. We will go ahead and get started so we have time for this great conversation. My name is Lucy Barrier. I'm a policy analyst here at the Hunt Institute. We are really excited about today's webinar. This is the first in a 3-part series in collaboration with Teach Plus, specifically focused on recruiting, preparing, and retaining diverse educators in our teacher workforce. This first conversation will be focused specifically on culturally relevant school environments. What do they look like? Why does it matter? And how does it relate to our ongoing efforts to diversify the teaching profession? To lead us through this conversation, we have 3 great panelists, and I'm excited to introduce Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera is the Director of Equity and Inclusion in Washington Township Schools. Dr. Dyrese George is the founder and executive director of the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance. And Nadia Razzi is a 2020-2021, lots of 20s, Teach Plus California Senior Policy Fellow and one of the authors of the Teach Plus report, Making Culturally Relevant Schools a Priority, Lessons from Teachers of Color in a Time of Crisis, which is serving as the basis of our conversation today. Before we jump in, I just have a couple of logistical remarks. We will have Q&A, however, we will not be unmuting or turning on cameras. So throughout this webinar, if you have questions, please include them in the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen, so you can type those questions in at any time, and we will get to those a little bit later during our dedicated Q&A portion. Additionally, if you would like to follow along with us, we will be live tweeting, and you can follow using the hashtag race and education on our Twitter account, which is Hunt_Institute. On that note, I would like to turn it over to our moderator to start our conversation today, Dr. Michael Savoy, who is the Vice President of Programs at Teach Plus. Dr. Savoy, over to you.
Thank you, Lucy. And thank you everyone for joining us today for what I'm sure will be an enlightening, powerful, and probably too short conversation with 3 great panelists. Today's topic is an extremely important one in both its timeliness and its often oversimplification at the expense of students. Building culturally affirming school environments is essential to closing the opportunity gap. And as we've seen lately, it's under attack in the name of anti-critical race theory. Research shows that teachers are the most important in-school factor when it comes to students learning, and a racially and culturally diverse teacher workforce contributes positively to a school environment that appreciates and provides success opportunities to all within the school community. Research also shows that while all students benefit from having a teacher of color, students of color especially flourish in classrooms with teachers who share their racial and cultural background. As Paulo Freire wrote, there's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. Structures of whiteness occur in all of our schools and classrooms, whether or not you are in a diverse school or a predominantly white student population. We're here to talk about how schools can bring freedom to all students so that students and staff of color feel seen, heard, and respected. I'd first like to talk with Nadia Razzi. Nadia, you were one of the authors of the Teach Plus report, Making Culturally Affirming Schools a Priority, Lessons from Teachers of Color in a Time of Crisis. From your research, can you take a few minutes to describe what are some key characteristics of culturally affirming classrooms and schools?
Sure, and thank you so much. So last May, I had this incredible opportunity to work with 3 other women of color in the Teach Plus Policy Fellowship. And we had the privilege of being able to conduct focus groups with 50 teachers of color across California, seeking to understand why teachers of color are leaving the profession at rates far more than our white peers. So in experiencing this wealth of knowledge, it became clear very quickly that teachers of color across race, age, years of service, content area, grade level, all across all of these factors, were experiencing extremely similar circumstances. And our analysis of this data pointed to a substantial and harmful lack of culturally affirming environments. So our teachers described feelings of being part of a school environment that was reactive in nature rather than proactive. So waiting to, experience an incident of hate on campus, or reacting to inequitable academic or discipline data, right? So reacting to that instead of kind of having this proactive lens. Not feeling safe having authentic conversations about race and racism on campus, or having to navigate discussions that were, always centered around the experiences of white people. Feeling this additional burden or the so-called invisible tax on teachers of color. And that can include several things, including translating, being considered a mentor or a disciplinarian for students of color, of not feeling supported in cultural proficiency efforts, which are usually being led by teachers of color on campus. And overall, just this feeling of being asked to do more and not feeling appreciated or valued for our expertise, our time, our emotional labor. So when you ask about key characteristics of culturally affirming environments, school leaders can consider the recommendations that we make in the report that you mentioned, making culturally affirming schools a priority, lessons from teachers of color in a time of crisis. So our first recommendation was to adopt a proactive approach. Like I mentioned, instead of just waiting for hate to happen and then saying, what are we going to do about it? Or, rather than just responding to these reports of disproportionate academic and discipline across students of color. And we can do that by setting and following through on explicit anti-racism goals, conducting cultural proficiency training for leadership, engaging in a clear and explicit multi-tier system of support that has constant progress monitoring. So it's not like, we're going to end up and see, we see at the end of the year that our students of color aren't performing, and it's kind of a surprise. And also embedding some type of a system of accountability. Right now, that's something that a lot of teachers experience is lacking in our schools, is that piece of accountability. We also need to empower teachers of color by elevating the work that we're already doing, assigning value to it. Maybe that means additional support. Maybe that means additional compensation, capacity building, allowing teachers of color to feel that they have some kind of, options in terms of leadership rather than just going into school administration, building that type of capacity to see other leadership opportunities for teachers of color. Incorporating structures of support that could include funding, training, like I mentioned, culturally proficient trainings for leadership. That's kind of the most important thing. And also just this examination of policies and practices at our sites. What are the areas that may be producing unintended racist outcomes, even if teachers or even if a school or a district is not intending for our policies or our practices to be racist, we are still producing racist outcomes. So there needs to be a real deep, meaningful examination of those policies and practices to see how we can improve. So this year's fellowship is building on that work that we started last year, and they're developing a toolkit for educators who are seeking to foster culturally affirming and anti-racist school environments. And we kind of are putting it into these domains. So thinking about how to create cultural proficiency in all the different areas of education. So first, curriculum and instruction, assessment and teacher training, professional development, policies, practices, school culture and climate, and personal and systemic reflection. So starting with that self-work and also reflecting on how we're doing as an institution. Hopefully we'll have that toolkit out soon. We can actually provide for teachers and districts and schools actual policy language that you can use, scenarios and examples of what a culturally affirming environment or a climate looks like and feels like, and also additional resources, including a continuum of continual reflection and growth, similar to the CSTPs that educators can kind of reflect on. How am I doing in terms of being culturally proficient, culturally affirming? And I want to just mention, before I let the other amazing panelists talk, that this is not something that we're going to say, I'm culturally proficient, or here I am and I have achieved a culturally affirming environment. This has to be an ongoing system of reflection and growth. And there is no, and there's no finish line. It has to kind of be this ongoing reflection, which takes a lot of, like I mentioned, emotional labor, oftentimes on the teachers of color. So that's where those systems of support can come in.
Thanks, Nadia. You mentioned, I look forward to the toolkit coming out, and you mentioned a lot of things, characteristics in the classroom that I think have implications for district support. So I'd love to hear next from Dr. Erica Buchanan Rivera, just to talk to us about how districts can support and encourage schools to become culturally affirming, and sort of what structures and systems must be in place for this to happen.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here. I value this topic. I tell people often when I speak that I am a survivor of K-12 induced trauma and prioritize the work of creating culturally relevant and affirming spaces for students as well as staff. And so to answer this question, the first thing that comes to mind is that leadership matters. From school boards to central office staff to building principals, equity-focused leadership is needed where a common language of DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion, is clear, it's embraced, it's understood by members of an organization. Leaders have to have a clear understanding of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means to their organization and determine practices that will help to foster and sustain equitable affirming environments. There's a misalignment if we say we value all, we welcome all, and then we are tone policing. We're policing attire. We have various strategies in place that are marginalizing groups of people. So we have to be very clear on what does diversity mean to our organizations, because an identity affirming space is not just a declaration of words, but it's a declaration of anti-bias, anti-racist work. It's actions. It's about the intent versus impact, knowing that we can have the best intentions as already lifted up, within this conversation. But what matters most is the impact, that we make in terms of creating those equitable spaces and environments. Therefore, if statements or missions are going to be drafted to emphasize the value of an identity affirming environment, we have to intentionally question our actions and how we as a collective are leaning into those values within our organizations. Some of the necessary structures that I have a tendency of lifting up within this work would include mirror work as well as systems work. Mirror work requires us to shine a light on ourselves and understand how we show up. We unpack our identities and we understand our social construction to recognize how we have been shaped to see others as well as value humanity. Paulo Freire, within Pedagogy of the Oppressed, talks about the importance of building a critical consciousness. And so within the school district I serve, we emphasize the importance of thinking critically about our systems and the sociopolitical context that students are operating in. Building the critical consciousness reflects our understanding also of educational as well as societal systems, that yield inequitable outcomes for students as well as for the colleagues that we work with. It also involves understanding the contextual experiences that may differ from our own. We have to understand the depths of the inequities that our students as well as colleagues may face, with a keen eye on historically marginalized communities and groups with the intent to make improvements of our systems to address the disparities. So importantly, building the critical consciousness requires us to take a deep look at ourselves and how our students perceive perhaps the partnerships that we are trying to establish within school spaces. I have been in buildings before where I've heard educators talk about the sound relationships and connections they have with students, and students may say the complete opposite, due to implicit biases, microaggressions. So we not only have to think about how we show up, but how are those partnerships perceived by those that we are serving within our community? Mirror work also has to be coupled with what I call systems work. It has to happen simultaneously. We have to analyze ourselves deconstruct our identities, understand how our experiences are contributing towards the ways we interact with others. But we also have to continuously critique our systems and examine the conditions for learning within school environments, including the climate, the policies, the structures that are lending to some of these disparities within achievement, within discipline, within all of the opportunity gaps that we are seeing within our institutions that impact sense of belonging, ultimately. So it's important to be transparent. We have to name inequities as a part of this systems work. We are not going to solve, any problems if we are not courageous enough to name what is plaguing our systems. And we have to analyze those identity threats that exist within our systems, as well as study what allows for those inequities to perpetuate. What is upholding, these inequities within our institutions? What's allowing for, whiteness to manifest within, curricular spaces, within policy decisions? We have to critique our systems and name what is harmful to students as well as staff, and analyze how through policies we have groups that may benefit from the structures that are in place, as well as groups that may be harmed by what we establish. So it's important to make sure that we're engaged in the systems work to critique what is happening, and also discuss the barriers that are prohibiting progress. That's a part of it as well. It's not just about naming, but also thinking about what is getting in the way of us working collectively to come up with the desired outcomes that we are discussing as a part of the systems work. And once you pinpoint those barriers, how do we work together, as staff, as leadership, to actively dismantle, those barriers that are harming students as well as their sense of belonging, and coming up with strategies as well as learning, experiences. This work is also about learning as well as unlearning. And we have to ensure that our staff knows how to be a responsive, educator and practitioner. And so we have to create those spaces for listening, those spaces for learning, those spaces to debrief, those experiences that may be unknown in some cases, or those experiences that, we are well aware of, but we need to put action behind, our, systems work plan. So I think it's so important to engage in this conversation around mirror work, making sure that we understand ourselves, that we unpack ourselves, but also importantly, thinking about organizational change and knowing what we know, about the ways our identities have been shaped and how we are responding to people within our communities. How are we working together to dismantle some of these oppressive structures that are not allowing for people within an organization, students, families, our, staff, to be their authentic selves.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Erica, for that. I really appreciate the nod to the individual work that educators need to do, and also the mentioning of student voice and understanding their perspective as well. And then moving on to sort of a systems look at what we're thinking about when it comes to culturally affirming schools and districts. I want to now move us with Dr. George here into thinking at a state level, thinking about some of the things that do affect the system very intensely can be state policy. So how does state policy play a role in creating and sustaining culturally affirming schools?
Thank you so much for the question. And I appreciate the opportunity to engage in the conversation. So it plays, in my perspective, and from my experience as an educator, plays a huge role. Everybody's fighting to make progress. Everybody's driving to do something better. A lot of times progress in the education space is driven by programs, which are obviously manned by people. I value programs. The problem that I've seen in my experience, in higher ed and working and being a teacher and working in ed prep and now doing this work in a social impact nonprofit, is that programs shift with leadership. A lot of times what happens, you have a phenomenal program in place, but when leadership shifts, and that can be just because of the social political climate people are voted in, or people retire, sometimes programs go away, especially if they're tied to budget. Somebody can say, this program can be phenomenal, it can have impact, but if it's not in alignment on the agenda of the overall collective area that a leader may be thinking, or people who may be influencing a leader, it can go away. And so what I've seen is that a lot of times when programs are rooted in a way where they are attached to a policy, it can have a little bit more sustainability. I'm just speaking from a personal perspective of work that I've seen here in Tennessee. So prime example, I think policy in many regards in the work that I've been able to engage in has impacted people, preparation, and then also that pedagogical practice. And for primary example for people, Tennessee has now breached over 1 million students. 40% of our students are students of color. For almost 30 years, we had legislation that required the state of Tennessee to have a educator diversity policy that will require every district in the state of Tennessee to have a goal that was reflective of the students of color that they serve, and also the strategies that they would use in order to retain and recruit and retain educators of color. That policy lived for almost 30 years and had not been developed by the State Department until more recently. And so when I found out about it, there were people at the State Department that had created drafts. Our team was able to provide feedback on those drafts. We created a council in partnership with the Education Trust here in Tennessee, trained up local educators across the state in urban, suburban, rural to engage with the state board members, the constituents of the state board members, and advocate for them to adopt this policy once it came up for a final read. That policy was unanimously adopted in February. So now that the policy is adopted, one of the things that we're seeing now is that because there's an overflow of ESSER dollars, people have to adhere to this policy. They have to have a goal and have to have strategies. They're now utilizing additional funding to think about how they can then impact their educator diversity goals in relation to the students that they're serving. Because this is a topic that many people knows exists, but have not done a lot around. Our team has been partnering with districts to help them figure out what does your goal need to be. What we don't want to see is districts that have grown proportionally by students of color 20-30%, and you're setting this lofty goal of 20-30%, but your data shows that you've only increased 5 or 3 or 2% over the last couple of years. And so let's be intentional, let's be strategic, but policy requires us to do something. The good thing about policy in my case is that if it's harder to undo in some regards. And so if leadership shifts, we get a new commissioner, which we know these things are going to probably happen, that policy is still intact, and advocates on the ground within the form of teachers, policymakers, community stakeholders can continue to advocate that we do the right things, that we continue to do things in the vein of equity and be able to have the level of impact that we have. Additionally, it allows us to contextualize our programs that we will create to our local context. So the policy says we have to do this, but if I'm in a rural district and I may have an influx of Latinx students, but I know my staff is not diverse, how do I contextualize creating programming that will drive and adhere to this policy, but make it specific to my local context? So I think that is one of the things that I've seen. I do think that we have an opportunity to make sure that we have more policies, which I think we're leaning in on from the lens of preparation and also practice. From the preparation lens, I say it all the time, there's nothing that I learned in my prep program that prepared me to go be the only Black teacher in the building for almost 6 years. There's absolutely nothing. We know these experiences happen. If you have a candidate of color in a prep program somewhere, somebody's going to take a job somewhere. They're going into a racially isolated situation. They're going into a place that's not going to value them, honor them, give them and train them with the opportunities to be successful. That is a fact. How do we lean in on more broader statewide policy that makes sure that, hey, while we're preparing people, now at the same way we say, let's have culturally relevant materials for our students, let's make sure we have that for our candidates too. Let's prepare them for the realities that exist. Let's be culturally affirming in our practice. And so I think having opportunities where we can shift state policy in ways that touch everybody, so people can contextualize to the people that they're serving, that is a lever that can be primed and moved in order to make the shifts and the changes necessary for us to see success. We see small examples of that. And it's like, how do we scale that across these major areas in education that we care about, and then allow people to contextualize down to district levels and then down into school levels. That way the impact can be tangible, but more specific to who actually is been impacted.
Thank you, Darius. Excellent. Thank you, panelists. I now have just a couple of questions that are just opening up to the three of you here. And it was great, Darius, you were talking about policy and policymakers. This question is geared towards that. As educators and policymakers continue to debate the inclusion of critical race theory, or what others are calling critical race theory, in K-12 schools, can you tell us what the inclusion of race-conscious curriculum looks like in the classroom? And this is for any of you, either three of you.
I can jump in. And I appreciate the framing, because this is not even a debate about critical race theory. First and foremost, as someone who has taught CRT courses on a collegiate level, but it has everything to do with acknowledging race and having courageous conversations about race. So race conscious curriculum acknowledges the truth, about our history, the triumphs, the pain, the inequitable foundation, of our country, built off of stolen indigenous lands. However, all of that information is used to help students to think critically about the world around them and to become agents of change. Educators do not shy away from conversations about race and race-conscious classrooms and affirm the lived experiences of students. Within my school district, we have made it very clear that although we may not teach critical race theory due to its nature of being established more on a collegiate level, we're not going to avoid conversations about race that may emerge within a learning environment. And race-conscious classrooms, educators also have to think about the stories, that are centered and the narratives that are omitted throughout texts and history. We intentionally think about the ways in which voices of color are also portrayed within curricular environments. There are books that may have images of people who look like me that may perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And so we have to apply critical pedagogy to our work and be critical examiners of what we consume. It's also important to think about school environments, the physical spaces, and what the environment looks like, what it feels like to students as well as staff of color who walk into those spaces, to think about the importance of representation and how those spaces serve as a mirror image. Thus, what are students seeing as they are living, as they are existing within those environments? When you're devising lessons, do you think about the identities of learners? Do you think about their history? Do you think about students with more asset-based thinking and the genius that they're bringing into the classroom environment? Are you looking at those who you're working with and serving and seeing their strengths and not viewing people with a deficit mindset? So it's so important to really think about those key questions. Who are we centering within our spaces? And how are we ensuring that those voices are heard, affirmed, and valued, as we continue to develop environments that truly meet the needs of an inclusive space?
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. And Tennessee is one of the states where we recently had legislation signed in the law that prohibits conversations around race, sex, gender, making folks feel uncomfortable, et cetera, but packaged as CRT. And we also have a punitive nature in ours where folks could actually lose their license and also lose funding for their schools if they are in a position of quote unquote breaking the law. And so to me, I think even taking a little step further, some of the lived experiences of students that we serve, particularly students of color, students from poor backgrounds, students with disabilities, are reflective. What they see and what they experience in the world is reflective of how they're treated in schools. And I think the reality is, and I can attest to it as early as kindergarten, is that most people, and particularly students of color, will never get to choose when they're going to experience racism. And to be honest, and to be perfectly clear, some of the most racist things happen in school. So here's the stomping ground in the soil in which we have the opportunity to support students, mold and model of how to create quote unquote global citizens and how they're able to respond to certain things in the world. But instead we take that ability away in some regard, when in actuality, many people were just doing the job that they were doing anyways in a very integrable, right way. And so I think the reality is that folks are put in positions to where they're working in spaces that perpetuate many of the things that they're quote unquote not supposed to talk about. And so if you do a Google search right now of racist incidents in schools in Tennessee, you will find several things, from teachers who have told students, hey, you should play this instrument because your lips are so big. You will find things where people have given assignments around envision yourself as an enslaved person. And what would you do if you were to be displaced? These things literally happen in Tennessee within the last 2 years. And so like the fact that we're restricting the growth of inquiry, discovery, and nurturing this ideal of the genius of our students in ways in which they can actually integrate into a global society, we take that away in the opportunity to mold and model. Everybody is developing a racial identity, and that racial identity can either be destroyed or developed in school. That racial identity, as we all know too, directly impacts your academic identity. So you being Black or brown directly impacts if you have access to early post-secondary opportunities, honors classes, dual enrollment classes, if you'll be overly disciplined, if you'll be overlooked for opportunities in the societies and clubs. That is a fact. And so the fact that you know, it's one thing to not have the curriculum that's racially conscious, but then the ability to be able just to mold and model folks on how to be, especially in a global society, is asinine.
I really appreciate that when you refer to, having discussions of race or sexuality or whatever these topics, you're saying, topics that make people uncomfortable. And again, we are displacing the needs of students of color and a lot of times our most vulnerable students to accommodate the comfort of white students or white teachers in our schools. So when we're thinking about this, debate about critical race theory, most teachers do not know critical race theory. We've never learned it. We're not, certainly not teaching it to our students, but what we are doing is espousing the tenets of critical race theory in a way that is empowering students. It's essential to truly make learning relevant for students and to empower them to take ownership of their own learning. So for me, teaching a literature course without these elements of critical race theory, so counter storytelling, centering BIPOC experiences, discussing whiteness and the permanence of racism, encouraging students to be critical about what we're reading and why we're reading it and why it's included in our curriculum. If I'm not doing those things, then students are not truly understanding or engaging in what they're reading. So when we are doing these things, students feel that they have agency. They feel a sense of belonging in school. They feel that they have something of value to contribute to the class and that they're learning critical discourse in addition to deeply understanding the material. And there was a question in the Q&A, if I can just quickly touch on that because it's connected. Somebody asked, what does a culturally affirming classroom look like? And what is an example of a lesson? When we're bringing in all of these tenets of critical race theory, basically, not only are we doing it in regards to the curriculum, but we're also doing it in terms of establishing relationships across the students and as well as the teacher to the student relationship. If you want specific, I know we're not really going to be talking a lot about specific curriculum or lessons, but if you do want to check out my website, nadiarazi.com, I have tons of available free lessons that you can use. All of my experience has been in high school, so high school English. So I have, if that applies to you, feel free to use any of the lessons. There's a ton of culturally relevant anti-racist lessons in there, but really to focus on the fact that what we're doing is centering the experience of people of color and examining critically why whiteness is the way that it is in our schools and why, certain books and certain things are taught and are assigned value while others aren't. So that's really that anti-racism piece. If we don't want to call it critical race theory, we could call it anti-racism, even though now people are saying, anti-racism is racist. Whatever it is, it's all in a line of things that is designed to silence teachers from encouraging students to think critically about what they're being taught and disrupting a power structure that has benefited white people. So yeah, there's tons of stuff on my website. Again, nadiarazi.com if you want specific learning outcomes or lessons or curriculum or things like that. You can feel free to access my website.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. First one, I want to sort of stick still to the school level and the classroom level, but think about some of the places that may find culturally affirming schools to be a challenge. So if we're talking about our predominantly white areas, districts, and schools, thinking about how do those areas, those schools specifically create a culturally affirming environment without singling out students, without tokenizing students who may be at a very low population there level. So talk to us any suggestions on a predominantly white led school and still being able to be culturally affirming.
I will say you just described my experience as a teacher. 85% of my students were white, you know, I had a great experience where I was at though. You know, I taught in the community I grew up in. I grew up in a more urban inner city part of town, but I taught in a suburban affluent part of town, and so those were eye-opening to me. And I think the reality is that there was no way I could divorce my racial identity once I got into the classroom and began teaching. I can't name how many white students would say, man, you're the first Black teacher I ever had in my life. I took that as in a way that, like, okay, I got to represent. I got to show you how I'm professional and I'm a genius, and like how Black is beautiful and bold and brilliant, and really embed that in ways of questions that I'm asking. And so we had opportunities where, you know, folks could, you know, there were things going on in the world while I was teaching. From the time that I was teaching, there was racial injustice taking place. There were shifts in president and all these things that people had questions, because most of my students, you know, while they may have had friends in school, they really weren't engaging Black and brown professionals outside of school and adults on that level. I know because they told me that. And so I was able to have open conversations with them. I think that being able to bring a level of authenticity, also having lived in the community, having seen things from a different lens that folks hadn't been able to experience themselves, sharing that was impactful for them because they genuinely did not know. Some folks were confined to a part of town where everything they needed was there, and they never had to see poverty. They never had to see struggle. They never had to see food insecurity and homelessness. Everything they needed or had to have mostly was right where they were at. And so being able to share some of the struggles that I had as a student in the same system that they're navigating, they just were unaware. And so I think me being able to not shed my racial identity, embody it, and embed it in my practice was a leveraging point that not only allowed my classroom to be culturally affirming, but also gave folks insight and perspective that they probably, I mean, they may have gotten it, but they probably wouldn't have gotten it in their K-12 experience. And I'm sorry, I taught high school, by the way. So most of the students were, you know, they didn't get it with me, you know, juniors and seniors were out the door, so.
Right. I've had similar experiences of teachers or of students telling me, obviously I'm not Black, but if, you know, even saying that I was the first teacher of color that they had, or that I was the first teacher to actually have a conversation in class about the N-word and not just expect students to read it while they were reading, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird or Mice and Men or whatever are the required books to read. You know, they're saying that these teachers are just pretending like it doesn't exist. And they are telling me, you know, this is the first time we've ever even had this discussion in their juniors and seniors in high school. So what I will say in regards to that, and I also taught at a predominantly white district, I saw this kind of in action. And, you know, during the 2020 demonstrations, a group of former students from our district came to the social studies department, came to the district and said that we want a more race conscious social studies curriculum, because what we were taught in high school did not cut it. You know, we're in college now, we're seeing what's happening in the world, and we need the district to kind of adopt this new or a more racially conscious curriculum. And when they had this, they held a forum. And essentially they were met with defensiveness, fragility, hostility from their former teachers who were saying, we do teach that. You know, if I taught it, but I guess you didn't understand it, or, you know, kind of like really putting the blame on the students instead of thinking critically and reflecting and saying, okay, obviously that what I thought I was doing is not coming across, right? So it really points to the necessity for mandatory sustained cultural proficiency training. That's something that we also saw was one of our findings in the report, is that, you know, there is cultural proficiency training, or there is this kind of idea of, you know, race conscious training, but it's optional. So if if this type of training were mandatory for all educators to really see what they were doing and the impact that it's having on their students, think about how different it would be. If students if students of color are coming to us and saying, this isn't working for me, and the response is, I'm going to keep doing it like this, then that's a problem. Or, and maybe they're afraid of backlash they're going to receive from the community, especially just like you said, Dr. George, if we're in an area that's predominantly white, I'm sure, you've had experience with receiving backlash for something that you have taught in class or encouraged students to think about. So we keep centering whiteness in these conversations, or we keep prioritizing the comfort of white people. And really what it needs to be is teachers thinking, reflecting with humility, and listening to the students, not, pointing to the Black student in class and saying, hey, what do you think? And tokenizing them and singling them out, but really allowing your classroom to be a space where students have agency and have that feeling of empowerment, that they feel that they can communicate when something is not working. And that's true for white and students of color, right? So we know that a culturally relevant curriculum is going to benefit all students, including white students. So allowing students to have that opportunity to give you feedback, tell you what is working and what's not. And as a teacher, not taking that as an attack and saying, I'm a bad teacher, thinking, okay, how am I going to partner with students? It kind of comes back to that power, that, the dynamic of power, and not saying I'm the expert in the room, but I'm going to partner with my students to see what is going to work for them.
Yeah, I would echo all of the sentiments that have already been shared. I taught elementary students, but grew up in a predominantly white school as an elementary student myself. And so when I talked earlier about the racially induced trauma that I had within schools, it stemmed from teachers not having a race conscious lens to their approaches, to their practices. I recall being in a classroom and there were students who were acting childishly within the back of the classroom, and the teacher without hesitation told those students to stop acting Black. So that led to my first courageous conversation with an adult to inquire, how do you see me, as I am sitting here in this classroom, trying to learn, trying to thrive. And what I distinctly remember about that moment was that no one within that classroom flinched. And that's just the power and that normalization, of whiteness, as well as institutionalized racism within schools. No one said anything. And so my whole career has been devoted towards disrupting that, decentering, whiteness within spaces, and having those courageous conversations with students so they can have their voices amplified. So to the point made about creating those spaces for listening, we want to create spaces where students can be heard, where we can elevate their voices, or we can listen to their experiences, and where we also provide tools, beyond just the listening, but we provide tools to help our students navigate as well as disrupt that normalization that occurs within educational spaces. It's so important for not just learning partnerships to be established, but also to ensure that students have the avenues and the opportunities to be able to work through, a lot of the discrepancies and disparities that exist, and prohibiting those authentic, identity affirming spaces within school environments. And so part of my work also has been to create a lot of affinity spaces for, our students as well, spaces that are brave, spaces where they can talk about what they are experiencing, where they can share that with school leaders, or we can also use that as a part of our strategic plan within our district, where we have goals and accountability measures. But it's so important to incorporate the voices of students, so you're not doing school to people. You want to be in community with those that you're serving. And the only way you're able to be in community is if you are actively taking the time to listen to the needs of those that you're working with. And in addition to creating those spaces for listening, learning, the affinity groups, and we've also worked hard to establish spaces for educators, district-wide, to have various cohorts and affinity groups to listen to our educators of color who may feel as if they're the only ones who are, navigating different experiences of injustice within their school spaces. So that's a critical aspect, to think about your staff of color and how are you creating those safe spaces for them to connect with others who may understand just what that navigation looks like. I also have to remind people that, going back to the critical consciousness piece, what we are seeing play out within this world right now, all the, inequities, the policies, the laws that are marginalizing, people of color, those are constructed and devised by people who did not have a critical consciousness built within educational environments, who were not exposed to conversations about race, who were steeped in whiteness, and there was not necessarily any work around decentering it. And so the conversation about race, about the decentering of whiteness, that is for everyone. It's not just for, school districts that have more, urban, more populations where, we're seeing a lot of these, disparities. It is for your predominantly white school districts. And we have to raise those conversations. We have to elevate them, in clear, transparent ways within schools. But I just want to emphasize that, again, we have to build this critical consciousness for all students. And also the work of having these conversations, we cannot use this myth that exists that our students are too young to engage and to have these conversations about race. I hear that quite often. My child is too young. I don't want them to engage in this discussion. Well, you know what? My first time being called the N-word was in kindergarten. So to that point, kids are experiencing racism and discriminatory practices at a very early age. So we do have to teach students at an early age, all students, how to be an ally, how to be an advocate, how to be an upstander, and give them the language and the tools to navigate those situations. But I think it's important just to reiterate that, all students should be talking about this within schools. And it's not limited to demographics, the setting, the type of school, system. It's about humanity, and this is human work.
Thank you. Our time is flying by. I'm going to try and combine some questions here through the lens of a teacher who may feel alone in wanting to do this work, but they want to be a leader of this work. Any advice from the three of you on how someone who may be feeling alone, how they move into that leadership space of either convincing the district that they need a culturally relevant curriculum, or maybe even talking to the community about the need for this culturally relevant understanding within the school. So what advice do you have for teacher leaders who want to lead in this work?
In my experience, the most important thing is to get the support of the community, to have depending on, it's going to depend on the district, which stakeholders they're going to value more. A lot of times, unfortunately, teachers are not those stakeholders that they value in terms of opinions on, how we can improve. And so I think it's really important to engage the community, empower the students, and have the students go to a board meeting and speak, have the community members come together and say, this is what we're seeing and this is what we need for our students. In my experience, that's been the most powerful thing, getting them, on your side and allying with them. Because like I said, I spent several years trying to convince a school district to care about how racist their curriculum and policies and practices are. And unfortunately, that's a really hard thing for a teacher to do, and oftentimes one teacher in isolation to do. So to get that community of like-minded educators, to engage the community and to empower the students to really speak out and make it heard that this is what we need in terms of the students' own education.
Quickly here, I think there's a couple things that you can do. We actually, part of the work I got engaged in when I launched my organization, I was still teaching, but I was getting pushed down a disciplinarian, been an administrative pathway realized I didn't want to do that because there was some disproportionality of how Black and brown kids in my building were disciplined. I didn't want to be the one putting kids out when oftentimes kids were sent to me to stay in school, the diffuse situations. So I got involved in these fellowships that were embedded in policy and advocacy, which I knew nothing about. That's another opportunity, I think, in the ed prep space. Most people in the ed prep space aren't learning about policy and advocacy and how the education ecosystem often works. Nonetheless, fast forward, I think understanding contextually what you care about, what is that inequity you're trying to address, what's been done, and what is the context behind it? Who's driving the work? If there's anything been done, the way you can have a sense of where you're starting at. The other thing is, I would say, leverage and also establish your network. People in your current network may not be in alignment with the work that you're trying to lead. So it's really important to really understand, like, if I'm moving forward, who's taking a step along with me? Building a community of coalition to rally around that, and then realizing that sometimes that change that needs to be enacted hasn't taken place and won't take place because they're waiting for you to do it. Now, that's a lot of burden, a lot of weight you put on anybody's shoulders, but that's a reality that exists where what you care about the most probably won't be touched and hasn't been touched in years, and it may not be touched unless you do it. No one wants to go it alone. So for some people who are really, really isolated, you might have to be a part of networks that are virtual and larger, broader in width to find out who's in your proximity and who understands uniquely what you care about as far as the inequity to help you be able to address it. But it is extremely challenging trying to attack large systemic problems, even if they're large just to your district or the community that you're in. They can feel as large by yourself. That is a hard thing to do. Build the community, leverage your network, and find out who's with you. Understand what's been done and what hasn't been done, what needs to be done, and what you have the capacity to do. You won't be able to do it all. It's almost impossible to be able to do it all. And so I know this is really broad response, but like those are starting points that I think allow me to build a network to really kind of see things grow over the last 5 years, to be in a place where I don't feel like I'm doing a lot of the work by myself anymore. And hopefully that's some hopeful insight to get you moving in the right.
Yeah, I think that really wraps it up as far as building the community around you, because you can't shoulder this work alone, and it shouldn't be the burden of people of color in particular to shoulder this work and to do it alone. And so I would advise for teachers to connect with leadership to see what spaces are available to the points that have already been made. And you may have to be in a position where you have to create those spaces that do not exist. I have been in a position where those spaces did not exist, and so I had to mobilize people to come together and create those affinity groups or environments that were advocating for equity as well as just communities. As a community organizer, I am a founder of an organization called Racial Equity Community Network. And that existed because we had a lot of families that felt disenfranchised within the community. And we needed to create a space for our families to have their voices be amplified, to understand the systems within the educational spaces so they knew how to amplify their voices, as well as knew the avenues to take in order to direct concerns and know how to evoke change. And so that became a community-driven organization just due to the fact that people were coming together, with a particular cause, wanting to eliminate a lot of the racial disparities as well as the acts of racism that we were seeing openly within the community. So sometimes you just have to take that initiative to create the spaces that do not exist, knowing that there are going to be some people who will have some common interests and who will also adhere to, the agenda as well as the goals that you're trying to create, as you engage in that work of developing it. I think it's important for educators to also think about the self-care in this work, and I want to stress that as well. I have been in that position to be under attack by various ideological groups for elevating these conversations within various communities. And so I think we also have to be very conscientious of when to push, when to reflect, as well as when to protect our peace, because this work is hard, and it's very challenging. But it's important, like I said, to seek those who are champions within this work, first and foremost, because we get through this work as we have throughout history, people of color, through the strength of our community. So I can't emphasize that enough, to find your people. And if those spaces do not exist, you may have to be in a position to create those spaces and opportunities.
Excellent. We are almost out of time. Any last words from any of our panelists? Sage advice as we move forward? We've had a lot of good ideas today.
I feel bad. There's so many questions we didn't get time to answer.
I know, so many.
Yeah, I'm trying to go in and ping a couple of them. As far as last words, I will say this for folks who are in the throngs and in the midst of trying to address, legislation like Tennessee has signed, and even more broadly, like just in general, but specifically in this season where you're trying to address that, stay in the fight. And also understand too, like a lot of people aren't hearing that the job you were doing was the job that you were supposed to do. And I think, because of the way, our systems and structures are placed, there are some people who are working in isolating capacities, whether it's racially isolation or just isolation in the social justice orientation. And there are colleagues waiting for them to slip up. There's a student waiting for them to slip up so they can tell a supervisor. And so those people are on edge right now, and they need some encouragement. And if that's you, encourage you to lean into networks who value you, honor you, who can lift you up and support you through the time. Because unfortunately, I think that it's going to, this type of climate and what is developed is putting people in a tough position to make some challenging decisions. And goodness knows we need all the great educators that we can on behalf of our students. So if that's you and people who you know in your network, I'm encouraging you to stay in the fight, know that you're not in it alone, and continue to lean into networks that can support you.
Excellent. Let's throw it back to Lucy to close us out.
Thank you all so much. My computer's being a little slow. Thank you so much for this conversation and for being with us today. This has been amazing. To Nadia's point, we did not get to all of the questions, but I do encourage you, if you did have questions that didn't get answered, or if you have more questions based on this conversation, please continue to engage with us on Twitter, again, using that hashtag. And our panelists are also tagged in our recent tweets about this webinar, so you can engage with them there as well. We do have some additional webinars coming up through the Hunt Institute that we hope you will check out and join us for. And the last thing is, when this webinar closes, there will be a survey evaluation. We encourage you to please fill that out so that we can continue to improve. But on that note, thank you all again for being with us today. This has been really great, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great rest of your Monday.